Photography Daily.
And as I'm leaving one day, there's a bus pulled up on the street, and all these people with cameras and notepads jump out, and they're looking around, and I think to myself, they're obviously lost unless they're doing tours of cattle country, because she lives in the middle of nowhere and surrounded by hundreds of acres of land with dairy cattle and meat cattle.
The day life changed for former hotel professional Dod Vickers, now in movies.
You run into somebody at a cocktail party or dinner, and they say, oh, Dod's in the film industry, and then they say, oh, really? Very curious and interested, and they ask what you do, and you say you're a location manager, and they have no idea what that means.
Well then, exactly what is it you do?
So it's a little bit of a casting process, kind of like what they do with actors, but it's where the actors are going to be put on stage, where they're going to perform and bring this vision to life.
A photographer, a location scout, a location manager, the life and soul of photographic conventions, I'm sure.
I'm actually fairly introverted and shy in a lot of ways. Some ways I have to turn that off and become more aggressive, because I'm blind calling on people by knocking on their door saying, your house is fantastic, we might want to shoot a movie here.
Today we find out about how a location scout's pictures can assist production.
It's very important to have a feeling for the tone of the film that they're trying to evoke with the movie. Then when you realize that it all started with one frame that you delivered from your camera, a still frame that then turned into a location that lives on in many, many, many frames.
We talk about how the C word has affected the business of filmmaking on Dodds Patch in particular.
The economic impact on Georgia was estimated to be $9.8 billion. So that's taking into consideration all of the money we spent here, to include restaurants that are eaten in, hotels that are stayed in, cars that are rented, gas that is bought, food that is bought that the caterer serves the crew, materials that are purchased to build the sets.
We chat about the genres of filmmaking.
Doing a film is like running a marathon, and doing TV or episodic is like running forever.
Beware the film geeks who live for the errors.
You have to look sometimes at what type of lines a road has. Center lines painted on roads here in the States didn't really become common until a certain time, and they wouldn't be in place before that. So can we black them out and then put them back?
And we talk about the realities of working in the most glamorous industry in the world.
We'll spend 12 to 14 hours filming a day, and of that you might see 3 to 5 minutes of that on screen.
Stories of life told by photographers, and today that photographer is Dod Vickers.
I had a friend that worked with Ridley Scott on a project, and when he first was talking to him on set one day, he said how much he admired a movie called The Duelists. I don't know if you're familiar with that film.
Yes.
It's one of his early works. It's a beautiful film about the Napoleonic War. And Ridley just looked at him and smiled and said, "F***ing telephone poles." And he said, "What?" He says, "I can tell you where every telephone pole is in France."
Patron of the day today is Mike South, and I'll link to his Instagram, of course, which is, in case you can remember, Mike South Photos. A photographer, 3D artist, and vintage camera collector, as you will see across his grid. Deeply envious of your Zeiss icon, Mike. And the photographs of the moon are just extraordinary. He's also a tabletop wargamer and RPGer, which I did have to look up, a husband, and self-titled colossal nerd, and exceptionally talented. For the price of a fancy large latte per month, patrons like Mike are helping to build and keep this podcast as a 3-day-a-week full-length photography show. Patrons get to hear the extra Tuesday and Thursday shows. Plus, there's also the benefit of broadcasting your website, projects or Instagram to the world in Patron of the Day. Is there a piece of camera kit in a cupboard, in one of those camera bags you've not looked in for a while, or tucked into a drawer, a lens, a flash, a camera, that sort of thing that you haven't used lately, and for some reason you're holding on to it, but you don't know why, or you'd forgotten maybe you even had it? Well, now is the time to turn that old kit into cash and go searching for it. If you are in the US, Europe or the UK, and you can spare just a few minutes, because that's all it takes, go to mpb.com and sell it using the simple process on the front page, which you're walked through. You'll end up with cash that you can either pocket or, of course, trade on the site for kit you'd rather have instead. Easy to do at mpb.com. Right, Dod Vickers. Now, I'll not need to do too much background, as he covers this off pretty nicely, actually. What I will say is that this is a show and story today that introduces a side of the photo business we've never mentioned before. Like all great stories, this one starts with an element of sliding doors, a fitting reference in terms of movie talk. I'm a sucker for tales of the unexpected, those things that happen to you which persuade your life to take a different path. The red or the blue pill, movie reference. The left or right fork, that kind of thing. So today, photography, but equally a fascinating glimpse into the world of filmmaking and the part that can literally shape the mood and look of the film or TV series. Those responsible for finding a location, photographing a location, then managing it. This is Dodd Vickers. So here's a magazine I would never have met or even known existed prior to a conversation with you, Dodd, about what we're about to discuss. The magazine is called Compass. It's the official magazine of the Location Managers Guild International. Who'd have thought? As I've found out within the first 2 or 3 pages, location managing and location scouting is not simply photographer finds place out of the way that one day may make a great place for the latest Star Wars, is it?
No, not at all. It's an interesting job, and it's one that I love, and I've grown to love more as I've learned more and more about it over my career. At first, I didn't understand all the aspects of it, but now having almost a little over a decade of experience, I realize how lucky I am to have found something I'd love doing so much that involves so many skills that I have that I value.
But it's sort of a kind of by chance thing, isn't it? You were working in the hotel industry. You met somebody that became pivotal to you taking your, what I like to call, left turn at the traffic lights. Just take me through that moment, that time where you thought, hang about, somebody's just asked me to do the most unusual job in the world.
Yeah, so my mother is a veterinarian, now retired, and my father was a building engineer. And growing up, the horses and animals and things were all part of our life. And my mother's a little older now, and we were at her farm, which was at that time about 30 minutes from my home, and we were helping take care of the horses and dogs and cats and things she has on the farm. And as I'm leaving one day, there's a bus pulled up on the street, and all these people with cameras and notepads jump out, and they're looking around. And I think to myself, they're obviously lost unless they're doing tours of cattle country, because she lives in the middle of nowhere and surrounded by hundreds of acres of land with dairy cattle and meat cattle. And I'm watching them, and this gentleman sees me sitting there and comes walking over and introduces himself. His name was Steve Dirks. And he asked if the property that I was mine, and I told him it was my mother's. And he said, we're going to be shooting a movie here, and we'd love to use your mother's property. And I said, well, I'll make the introductions and help. And because we were back and forth, the movie was called Wanderlust with Jennifer Aniston. And what I've learned since then, this is what was a tech scout, or recce as my British colleagues call it, where all of the department heads from the various departments that work on a project get together to look at the locations, talk about the scenes, and discuss what they need to do to be ready to film there. And he and I got to know each other over the course of about a month or so that they were preparing and filming the location. And towards the end of it, he asked if I was interested in a career change. And I asked a little more about the job, and he kind of explained the basics to me. He said, you've got the basic skills, with your experience in hotel industry. And I was former military, so I had a certain amount of discipline and things that he could recognize in our conversations. And he said, you've got the basic skill set, and the industry here in Georgia is about to explode. And we don't have enough people with that basic skill set to hit the ground running. You'd start at the bottom, but you'd work your way up. And I think you could move up fairly quickly with a little bit of experience. And I said, well, call me when you have a real job opportunity and we'll talk. And a few weeks later, he called me. And then he introduced me to Maida Morgan, who's another well-known location manager. And at that time, she was preparing for American Reunion, which is the 4th of the American Pie series. And I interviewed with her, and she offered me a job as a production location assistant. And that is the very bottom rung of the ladder in the department, where you're on set and you're just doing anything that needs to be doing, from setting up cones and landing the crew for parking and all of that. So I did several shows with her, and eventually, and with other location managers as they got to know I was around, and eventually got promoted to assistant location manager. And that's when I started learning more about the other aspects of the job beyond the logistics, including some basic scouting.
We're going to talk about the photographic side of it. Scouting manager, I'm seeing so many different descriptions for what it is you do. You're a location manager, but an element of that is scouting. Just explain to me exactly what your day-to-day is then, because you're a manager, not just a scout.
And there are quite a number of people that do nothing but scout, but primarily you run into location managers, and the location manager is often one of the first members of the crew that's hired. They probably selected a director. They may know the cinematographer. They may or may not have a production designer, but the script has been written. It's been approved by the studio. They've financed the project, and they've decided, okay, we're going to film this. Yeah. Who's going to hit the ground running for us? And it's a very there's so many jobs on the set that people don't understand what they are. So I can't say that we're the only ones that's underappreciated, but I think it's a job that most people don't understand. And you run into somebody at a cocktail party or dinner and they say, oh, Dodd's in the film industry. And then they say, oh, really? Very curious and interested. And they ask what you do. And you say you're a location manager. And they have no idea what that means. So we often get hired early. We get the script sent to us, and I do what's called a location breakdown. So I'll read the entire script. I'll make a list of the locations, try and see how many pages are being filmed at that location. Also get a sense of the tone of the film and what that location feels like in the story. So it's a little bit of a casting process, kind of like what they do with actors, but it's where the actors are going to be put on stage, where they're going to perform and bring this vision to life.
I want to read you a sentence. It's very funny you mentioned cocktail party as well, because I actually had a question here, which we kind of covered really, which was, when you go to a cocktail party, it must be fascinating. You're sat there and somebody says, well, I'm an accountant for KPMG, and well, you should speak to Dodd because he's a location manager, and everybody becomes your best friend because they're thinking, well, hang about, I've got a nice yard here that must be worth a lot of money for a day of filming. I assume that everybody is your best friend.
People are definitely interested, and you do run into that. A lot of people say, oh, I have a beautiful farm that I would love to, how do I get it listed? Or how do I get it looked at? Or I have a beautiful house. I think you would love filming there. Yeah. And my first question is, where is it? Because of the union rules. So there's zones we have to consider. So I always encourage them to send me pictures because you never know. I'm not very comfortable being the center of attention. That's one of the reasons I'm behind the camera. I'm actually fairly introverted and shy in a lot of ways. Some ways I have to turn that off and become more aggressive because I'm blind calling on people by knocking on their door saying, your house is fantastic. We might want to shoot a movie here. And you get this skeptical look from the homeowner. Like, yeah, sure. And then you kind of have to help them understand what's really going on and verify who you are and give them as many credentials as you can. And it's an interesting job from that perspective. But yes, people do get very interested in the job. They want to talk, and mainly they want to ask about the actors. Yeah. They're all like, what's so-and-so like? And or if it's a movie or TV show they're particularly fond of, like I did a little bit of scouting for Stranger Things. And my nieces just are over the moon that I've seen these people and know where these locations are and know the crew and things like that. So it depends on who you're talking to, what project they get excited about, and what kind of questions they want to ask.
Well, this is bizarre because not only did you mention the cocktail party when I had it written down here, now you mentioned Stranger Things. And I was about to say, if you ever meet Winona Ryder, please let me know.
I have not met Winona Ryder, but I will. I've heard you mention her before.
It's turning into Stranger Things. Look, I'd like to read a sentence from an email we exchanged, because this is where the picture making and the photography comes in, really. You wrote to me, the challenge is how to photograph a place to evoke the tone and emotions that you get when you read the scene in the script. When you're in collaboration with cinematographers like Roger Deakins, who are poring over your photos, looking for inspiration, it can be incredibly rewarding when they fall in love with a place because of your photos. Now, I mean, you could be, really, Dodd, the make and break without knowing it. If you're having an off day behind the lens, the entire movie shooting schedule could change.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, we found for a project like Prisoners, I was an assistant manager and did a little bit of scouting for that, but primarily I was doing a lot of the logistics. But it's very important to have a feeling for the tone of the film that they're trying to evoke with the movie. Then when you realize that it all started with one frame, one frame that you delivered.
You did, yeah.
from your camera, a still frame that then turned into a location that lives on in many, many, many frames in the movie that you worked on. That's the incredibly rewarding part, is that one frame from your camera from a day you spent scouting turned into a location. So yeah, it's an interesting process. You've got, especially when you're working, and I know there's a lot of filming in London, or has been a lot of filming in London and other parts of the UK, but you see a lot of the same locations over and over again, but often they look quite different. And that's the challenge. We've got locations here in Georgia that get filmed quite a bit because they have a unique look, and you may be creating an atmosphere that's supposed to be Los Angeles or Chinatown in Atlanta. Yeah. And so there's certain areas that you can pull that off, and there's certain areas you'll never pull it off. And so a lot of these places get shot over and over again, and you try to avoid them, but sometimes you have to go back to them and figure out, okay, how do I shoot this in such a way that it doesn't look like the same place they just saw in another movie, so they can envision how they can then turn it into what they're looking for.
Just how tricky has this time been for the industry? I mean, as far as the industry is concerned, this an industry reliant really upon human contact and travel. It must have been a tricky time.
Yeah, we totally shut down. We were prepping for filming for a film I did finish late last year. We were preparing to go into production in March of last year, and I got the call because everybody was watching what was happening with COVID, that everything was stopped.
Yeah.
The industry as a whole pretty much shut down at that point, and we were all figuring it out. And then about June of last year, I got the call that they were going to go back to work, and there was a lot of time spent in the Location Managers Guild, as well as the Directors Guild, SAG-AFTRA, all the various unions that are involved in filmmaking, talking about back to work. How do we get back to work and do it safely? So there's a lot of testing. I get tested multiple times a week on some projects, minimum one time a week I'm tested. I've now been fully vaccinated. A lot of more people are obviously able to get vaccinated now, but I was lucky enough to be able to get vaccinated for various reasons and had nothing to do with production. But we are all tested. We are all masked. There is less contact with the central cast from the extraneous crew that works on the periphery. Yeah. We work in zones. You wear a badge that indicates what zone you're in: red, green, yellow, with red being the ones that are cleared and tested multiple times a week to ensure they have the most likely possibility of not being infected or exposing someone.
It's almost like the travel industry, isn't it? I mean, as I look through that, the link that you kindly sent me to that magazine, as I looked through it felt like there were adverts in it. Film the world in Jordan, come to Estonia, Lithuanian tax incentives. It's a huge industry, isn't it? I mean, I don't just mean the film industry. I mean the location industry.
It is, yeah. And in fact, one of the statistics that's thrown around a lot here in Georgia, the last year before COVID, the economic impact on Georgia was estimated to be $9.8 billion. Wow. So that's taking into consideration all of the money we spent here, to include restaurants that are eaten in, hotels that are stayed in, cars that are rented, gas that is bought, food that is bought that the caterer serves the crew, materials that are purchased to build the sets, paint, anything that goes into making the movie. And then the salaries on top of that of primarily local crew that live here. So it's become a very big industry in Georgia. And there are more and more places looking at the idea of offering incentives to attract the industry because they're seeing the positive impact.
Just extraordinary numbers. We're talking generalistically, Dodd, about a film business. But of course, this is television and film. It's the era of the box set, after all, for TV. What's tougher to work on, TV or film?
Oh, TV, I think, is definitely. I think they both have their unique problems and difficulties that you have to overcome. But TV is definitely a lot more work in my mind. We joke that TV, doing a film is like running a marathon, and doing TV or episodic is like running forever. With TV and episodic, for the most part, you don't have all the scripts before you start. So I'm working on a show now that has 10 episodes. We just got the script for the 10th episode, and we start filming on Monday.
What?
Yeah. So we knew some of the locations because they were previously established in previous episodes, but now we had a few new locations, which we have fortunately been out looking for, but things were not being picked. And so until we got the scripts, they didn't know exactly how it was going to work. And suddenly they started making decisions. So we've been spending the last couple of days, talking to property owners, trying to get permits in place. We have to try and anticipate what the production needs. So in some cases, we went ahead and put permit applications in motion so that once we knew what we were doing and had a schedule that we could rely on, we could either look at those and say, okay, it matches, or here's where it doesn't match, and we apply for a change, which is easier than starting from scratch. So yeah, there's definitely two aspects to the job. You've got the creative role, which involves photography, and then you move into a very managerial and logistical role of where does the crew park? Where do we eat? Who do we have to talk to? Who am I inconveniencing? Which neighbors are going to be impacted by those lights that are in the sky at 2 a.m? Well,
I'm glad you mentioned permits, because I spied a handful of places that boast the fact no city permit required, which led me to wonder if it's something in your remit too, which clearly it is. One of the toughest parts of the job, I would imagine. I mean, as photographers, we do bump into it occasionally where somebody says, oh, you've got to have a permit to photograph here, mate. And you're never quite sure if that's right or wrong. And it's a big banana skin, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And major metropolitan areas all have permit processes in place. Smaller towns typically do not. So in City of Atlanta, for example, we know we have to have a permit. So it's the first thing we do. There's a monthly film permit. Then every street we want to film on, if we're impacting any public right-of-way, we have to have a permit. So it's based on where are we parking our trucks. Okay, I need 400 feet of this north lane of this street. But then you go to a small town, like we rolled into Barnesville, Georgia, which we made into the city of Wind Gap for HBO's Sharp Objects, and met with the mayor and the city manager, and they gave us one point of contact and said, this young lady will handle everything you need. Just tell her what you need. She'll get the police for you. She'll close the streets. Whatever needs to be done, we'll take care of you.
Back with Dodd Vickers in a moment. If you haven't yet, be sure to look up our Insta feed for the show, which is at photography.daily.podcast. Right now, I'm personally asking you to help the grids look by submitting your incredible strong black and white pictures, which we'll tag, of course, when used. Drop me a line, studio@photographydaily.show, or of course you can message through Insta. We'll have these links, as always, in the famous show notes. Also, our friends at Studio Ninja, the studio management software people, they still have this offer for Photography Daily professional photographers. If you are running your business through multiple calendars, spreadsheets, and written to-do lists, it takes less than 30 minutes to set Studio Ninja up, and then you'll have everything in one place. Your diaries, your workflow, your invoicing, address book, e-sign contracts, and you get 50% off your first year of use by entering the code PHOTODAILY50, that's the numerical 50, when you go to studioninja.co. Links on the show page, of course. Let's return then to Location Scout, Location Manager, Dodd Vickers. But there are buildings as well that offer particular problems, I'm sure. I mean, let's talk about IP and copyright and all that sort of stuff. I mean, you can't... the one that's coming to mind, I know it's not one that's necessarily featured in any of your films, but is the Eiffel Tower. Which of course you're not permitted to film, photograph for any sort of commercial purpose at all. There must be buildings like that when your director says, I think I'll shoot that way, Dodd, and you're thinking, no, because I know that person's going to create a real storm about their building being in your film, and you don't have the permission for that one.
There's only one iconic building here in Atlanta that poses a real problem, and I won't mention them for the same reason. But if you look at their building and they find out, they do create huge problems for you. It's an older building. It's beautiful. But if you film there, it's a process. Yeah. Fortunately, if we're not featuring a building here, we can pull it off without getting permission. So if we go out and film a scene on the street, unless you're featuring a building and it's staying in frame and you recognize it, or it's playing as that building, or if it has logos on it, that's another thing we have to worry about a lot of times. Then we have to get clearance for that or frame it out. And quite often it doesn't pose a problem because we're pretending we're somewhere else anyway. So they don't want to shoot anything that's incredibly recognizable. because you will take you out of where you're supposed to be. I did Den of Thieves, which is entirely Los Angeles based film, and we're filming it in downtown Atlanta. So when we would pick streets, we would try and pick things that had the tone of a gritty part of Los Angeles, but not show any one particular building too long, so people knew there's no way they're in Los Angeles. In spite of that, you'll go to the different blogs after a movie comes out, and they'll point out where you see the Bank of America building in the background and know that's in Atlanta or something like that. So it's very rare that you're playing Atlanta for Atlanta. It's mostly you're pretending you're somewhere else.
I tell you, the continuity geeks must be the bane of your life, mustn't they?
Oh, absolutely. And that's another thing that, I didn't think about until I started working on some pieces that were period pieces too. Because here in the States, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which regulates the access to buildings and needing ramps for wheelchairs and things. Well, that didn't go into place until the late 80s. Yeah. So if you're filming a project that takes place in the 70s or 60s, suddenly you're worried about shooting a building that has a ramp in front. How do we hide that? Because it would not be appropriate for it to have been. You have to look sometimes at what type of lines a road has. Center lines painted on roads here in the States didn't really become common until a certain time, and they wouldn't be in place before that. So can we black them out and then put them back? I had a friend that worked with Ridley Scott on a project, and when he first was talking to him on set one day, he said how much he admired a movie called The Duelists. Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with that film. Yes. It's one of his early works. It's a beautiful film about the Napoleonic War. And Ridley just looked at him and smiled and said, "Fucking telephone poles." And he said, "What?" He says, "I can tell you where every telephone pole is in France." He says, "If you don't see a telephone pole in my frame, I'm probably got my back in the camera right up against it," because he was constantly having to frame out telephone poles for all these great vistas that he was shooting for these battle scenes and duels and things. Yeah. So that's always interesting how much people really look at these things.
Well, that must be kind of your job as well. I mean, surely a director will be saying to you, "Dodd, do not bring me a place that has this, that, and the other."
Yeah, and also they'll tell you things like, "Find me something unique." So for example, I'll say that we need I did a project that required kind of an evil company headquarters. Yeah. And they didn't want it to be an office building. They wanted it to be something that if an evil futuristic company created an office building would totally look different than anything else. And we filmed it in the High Museum of Art here in Atlanta, which is a very contemporary, beautiful white building with open spaces, but it's certainly not an office building. But we moved into it and dressed it to make it an office building. So we also try to think outside the box. What is out there that is not an office building, but could fit the role of an office building that suits the tone of this movie?
Well, you mentioned post-production, and I read an article that was suggesting, the advancement of CGI and other methods, that location scouting, in some respects, may be threatened by keeping it indoors in what's called these volume stages. Is it reality or likelihood that something like, I don't know, a James Bond roof running scene could be done on a large volume stage?
Well, obviously, a lot of that is done because it's impossible to pull off certain things on a practical location, but there's still cost considerations. And a lot of times they like going to what we call a practical location versus even working on stage because it doesn't make economic sense to build something when it's sitting right there built and ready to shoot. So it depends entirely, I think, on what project you're working on. I know Mandalorian worked quite a bit on a stage that was giant screens. It's a new technology and it looks beautiful, but then they actually have to go onto practical locations for certain other things. So even for those scenes, not all of the backgrounds are created. They'll start with a template for whatever scape. Maybe they go shoot a desert and rocks and things and then paint in more that they then display on the screen behind the actors. But I think like any industry, you adapt and change. And if you're not willing to adapt and change, you get left behind. So, we're thinking about all those things, but I haven't experienced it yet. I think a lot of people thought that location scouting would change dramatically before we got back to work right after COVID. And the primary change has been the 360s. Both of the shows that I've done, the movie and the TV show I'm working on now, have required 360 scans of the primary locations so that they can utilize them for virtual tech scouts instead of taking 50 people to a location to look at it and talk about it.
Yeah, I think it's important actually to mention the kit. We don't talk about kit too often, but you're mentioning 360s, stills camera 360s. What are you using?
Currently, I'm a Fuji guy, but I started with an X100. Well, my first camera, I was a Nikon person for a long time.
Yeah.
Then I worked with a production designer that was using I think he had the X100T maybe, and loved what the pictures looked like, and I loved the way the camera looked. And I'd never seen it before. And I started seeing his images on the displays that we were looking at, talking about, I would shoot a picture and then he would go with me to look at the location. He'd take some pictures of his own, and then I would see them side by side and just fell in love with the way the Fuji sensor delivered the imagery and the color saturation and whatnot. But then the newest piece is my Insta360 1R, which is essentially it's a GoPro size 360 camera. Yeah. And it comes with a tripod stick. It's not the most stable thing in the world. I've kind of upgraded a little bit with a different foot. But you can walk in and using your phone you control the camera and you capture these 360s, and you can do an entire house in about an hour. And then you ship them off to one of the services like MetaReal or Matterport. And they process them and turn out a floor plan with measurements using the LiDAR features. So the art department can actually look at a couch in the room and drag on 2 points and get measurements, and they can figure out how big the windows are and have a lot of the information that we would need to spend hours on site getting from those images to get them started at least.
So you're a fellow podcaster, Dodd. Locations on 2, a podcast about location management. Does what it says on the tin, really. It is quite a niche podcast, though. I dare say some of the folk you talk to are sort of the quiet heroes we would usually never know exist.
Yeah, it's one of I started, I used to do a podcast about magicians. I think I sent you an episode of.
You did.
Years ago. And I've always loved podcasting because of the niche feel of it. There's a lot of topics out there. We used to joke there's a knitcast. If you're into knitting, there's a knitcast.
There is, yeah.
And there is a knitcast.
I found one all about pizzas. I mean, the amount of podcasts about pizzas is quite incredible.
It's funny to me that people think podcasting is so new. When we were doing it, I have a good friend that does a show called Coverville that's been one of the oldest podcasts out there. It's almost 2,000 episodes, I think now, talking about cover songs. And he's one of the biggest, oldest podcasts out there. And I did the Magic podcast starting in 2008 and did 330 episodes or so. But we kept talking about the fact that so few people know what location management is and understand the critical role that the location manager and scouts play in the creative aspect and development of a film. And I just wanted to do something that helped raise the profile a little bit. And so we talk, I try to talk about the creative aspect. Sometimes we talk about kit and how they shoot, because you find everybody shoots something different and has their favorite lens. But then we also talk about the challenges, if you're going to shoot on a bridge, how you pulled it off, whatever creative challenges you've had with different directors. So we get some of the war stories from the location managers on the ground. And we call it Locations on 2. Simply because when you're on set, we're on radios. And if you need to talk to a certain department, they'll tell you to switch to channel 2. And so you'll be on set and you'll hear locations go to 2. And when you flip over, you acknowledge locations on 2.
I wonder what the 2
is. And that's where you
about.
Go to have a more detailed conversation. Yeah.
I would imagine, knowing how much work goes into the business and what you do, you make sure all your family are sat down until those last credits are rolled at a movie theatre, don't you, Dodd? You are not going till my name has rolled up.
Well, it makes you appreciate all the other names that are in the credits as well. Yeah. I'm always surprised we're not higher in the credit list, so I don't have to sit quite as long. But we do stay till the very end of the credits now, because there's so many people that work so hard. Yeah. I got a statement the other day regarding how many hours I've worked on the project I'm on, and I'm almost at 1,000 hours already. And what's amazing to me is when you think about it, we'll spend 12 to 14 hours filming a day. And of that, you might see 3 to 5 minutes of that on screen. So the amount of time and energy and the man hours and the hard work that everybody that works on a project put into a project, you look around and you see these hundreds of people standing around. You're like, they can't all seriously be needed here, but they really are.
Do you know some advice you should give to all directors? always put the bloopers in at the end, because that makes me stay right to the end.
Yeah, that and the little teasers for the upcoming. I think Marvel has mastered that now, giving you little cutscenes to tease you and whet your appetite for the next project.
Look, a bit of a left field question to close. What is this thing I read about inflatable people in scenes? For me, that reminds me of Steve Martin's Autopilot, an airplane. Is this a real thing? Are some of the extras actually inflatable?
I have seen that done. You do see cardboard cutouts. You'll see all sorts of things. Now, it depends on the budget of the project and what they think is going to be most effective for them. The soccer film that I worked on was working with a digital company that had done a commercial for Nike, and they showed me some footage, and none of the crowd is real. All of it is digital. They'll shoot a small piece of the crowd, and then they'll paste it together and overlap it to make it look like a complete crowd. But I have certainly been in environments where you look up and you'll see a cardboard cutout or a blow up political figure that somebody stuck a different colored wig on or something. And suddenly that's a member. And then they'll put that in amongst real people to fill the space. It looks a lot better than what you're seeing in professional sports during COVID, where you see these giant cardboard cutouts behind the plate or something. But it's pretty believable when you're standing there and you're standing far off looking at a crowd. You really can't spot it as much as you think you would. I think it's funny to watch the background personally, because the background extras sometimes really get into their roles. You know, they're kind of just giving context and filler in back of, like, just walk back and forth here or stop and look in this window. And some of them really think they're giving an Oscar-winning performance, and I find it a little distracting sometimes if I start watching the background actors.
My thanks to Dodd Vickers. And that's it for today. Keep sending your questions or feedback to studio@photographydaily.show so that I can feature you in the mailbag edition, which is the Friday Photo Walk. Wednesday, now, the wonderful stories of photo legend Albert Watson, OBE, starting with his first big fashion gig.
I got into the elevator and kind of ripped open the envelope. I looked at it quickly, and it looked to me like it was $150 for 5 shots.
It's a fee that turns out to be somewhat different. There are so many stories. How was that Jagger picture done? You know the one, the double exposure, the big cat, slight spoiler, but not completely, working with Kate Moss, and being regarded as a legend. Lots to talk about on Wednesday. Music in the show was from artlist.io, and I look forward to photographing with you, hearing from you and talking with you next time.
Photography Daily is a Loading Zone production.